Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the webinar, The Roles and Uses of Artificial Intelligence in Resource Discovery, with our presenter, Jerry Thurber. Before we begin, I would like to remind you that this webinar has been pre-approved for IHR certification credits, 1 HRCI webcast recertification credit, and 1 HRCI e-learning credit. Please be sure to attend the complete webcast in order to receive your credits. If you are joining us live, you will receive an email from hr.com within 1 to 2 business days. It will include the certification credit information. You can also log in to hr.com and go to your My Certifications page, where you can see the credits you have received and also find out about our recertification program and new e-learning webcast pass. If you have any questions today for our presenter or for hr.com, please type them into the Questions tab on your GoToWebinar control panel, and we will follow up with you. And now it's my pleasure to turn it over to our presenter, Jerry Thurber.
Good morning and welcome. I appreciate you attending my webinar today. As Kathy mentioned, the title is Roles and Uses of Artificial Intelligence in Resource Discovery. What I'm going to talk about is how AI will, or artificial intelligence, will improve resource discovery in the age of the social workforce. I intend on going through the entire presentation and then answering questions at the end. But as Kathy mentioned, please feel free to put questions in as you think of them, and then at the end I'll address those. Again, I wanted to mention that now I'm frozen. Kathy and I tested this about 5 times.
Jerry, try clicking on the slide again.
Good. We got it. Sorry about that. So again, my name is Jerry Thurber. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a company called Inatrieve. Inatrieve is essentially an HR data science company, and you'll understand a little bit more about what I mean by that as we move on. Prior to being the CEO of Inatrieve, I spent several years as the general manager of ADP's Applicant Management Systems Group, also known as Virtual Edge. So I have kind of a background in this area, and both in sourcing and in AI research. So my presentation objectives for today, there are 4. First of all, I'm going to start out by defining a little bit about what I mean by AI and how that relates to human resources and sourcing in specific. I'm also going to talk a little bit about then important trends that drive the value of AI-based techniques. I'm going to talk about how AI enables sourcing professionals and job seekers. And I'm going to talk about how you will be using AI in the future. So why the big interest in artificial intelligence and in big data? The reason for the interest really is somewhat obvious. First of all, the digital footprint, or the amount of information that people leave about themselves, is gigantic. But it's so unrelated and disparate that it's difficult to understand the information. So what's happening is that some of the modern science techniques are beginning to take that data and turn it into relevant, actionable information that human resource professionals can use. Before I get into some of the details, I want to step back and have you think about a little bit of a thinker toy. And the thinker toy is, could data availability change our work-life balance? And I really like this sort of in-your-face quote from Mitch Joel at Control-Alt-Delete. And I'll just read the last part of this paragraph. And he basically says, the most adaptive path for you to find your success will be in your ability to forget about the notion of work-life balance and find the blend in your work, personal, and community life. And the reason why I started with this is that as we go through this, one of the things about artificial intelligence and big data and all the rest of that stuff that's going on is that there's an increasing line of blur, or an increasingly blurred line between when you're actually working and when you're not working, and how relevant that set of data and data points are to what you're doing with your life, and then where does privacy come in? And so we'll talk a bit about that as we go. But now I'm going to jump into sort of the main section of Section 1, which is describing artificial intelligence. So what is artificial intelligence as it relates to resource discovery? First of all, here's kind of a dictionary definition. And basically the last sentence says it's a system that perceives its environment and takes actions that maximizes its chances of success. But for us, in the resource world, what it really means is that we use data to understand how patterns help predict a goodness of fit. So what is this idea of AI pattern recognition and how does it work? There are essentially 4 elements to it. The first element is AI attempts to understand overlaps in data. The second element is it tries to see the patterns in that data. The third is that it tries to see that it's frequent. So in other words, if it overlaps once, the pattern is relatively low and it doesn't happen very often, then it isn't a very relevant piece of information. And the last is consistency. Does it happen all the time? So let me use a real quick example here before I go on. Let's say, for instance, that you're assessing the concept of Java as a skill set. And you're looking at multiple kinds of job descriptions that actually use Java in it. So let's say it's a LAMP developer or an open systems programmer or actually a Java developer or a Ruby on Rails programmer. And you begin to notice that, that depending on their backgrounds and skills and experiences, each of those job titles would overlap. You begin to see a pattern that, for instance, maybe people who identify themselves as .NET developers really don't also identify themselves as Java developers. But then you also begin to notice frequency, that every time somebody says they're an open systems developer, they always have Java included in it. And then you also notice consistency, which means that or actually frequency is that it's done a lot, and then consistency is that every time somebody mentions an open systems developer has Java in it. So essentially you can see how AI begins to recognize those patterns, and then later on in the discussion I'll show you how we can leverage that to help in resource discovery. But here's a real quick simple example that I'll expand on later. So if you think about the fact that there are multiple job titles out there, and here I've got 2 sort of identified. One of them relates around the idea of testing and software testing and quality assurance, the other one around geology. And then there are a set of skills that happen. Sometimes they may all exist in one area, and sometimes they may only exist partially in one and not in the other. And you begin to analyze that data to see where the relationships are between different job titles and different skill sets to begin to create job clusters. And so that's essentially what's going on behind the scenes with AI as it relates to resource discovery. So now let me talk, before I get back into AI and how you use it, let me step back and talk about the trends that are driving the use of AI in today's world. There are 4 trends that I'm going to go through right now with you. The first trend I'm going to talk about is workforce trends, the changing way in which we work. The second is data trends, how new information is being developed out there and how we might use it. The third area is company trends, which is how companies themselves are changing the way they work. And then the last is job trends themselves, which I call multidimensional skills and backgrounds. So let me start with work trends. There are 4 areas in work trends that I want to talk about. The first is the fact that technology now allows people to work wherever, whenever they want to. And these trends, by the way, what I'm talking about here is I'm giving you an idea of why traditional tools for career development, job description, resumes, etc., may become increasingly obsolete as we move forward because of the change in the way the workforce works. So the first one, again, is technology allows people to work wherever, whenever they want to. The second is generation whatever, call it generation Y, generation whatever, the millennials. They don't necessarily see themselves as employees, but instead see themselves as people who deploy their skills in a mutually beneficial way in order to gain an income. But they don't necessarily see themselves as employees in the traditional sense. The next workforce trend is that people will go in and out of building their own thing. I'm not sure where I saw this statistic, but it said something to the effect of people under the age of 30, I think it was something like 60% of people under the age of 30 think they will try an entrepreneurship adventure at least some point in their life. Whether they do or not is a different question, but certainly people are going in and out of doing their own thing a lot more than they used to. And the last trend that I wanted to talk about with workforce is people want to work more independently, but they still want to be part of a team. The next major trend is data trends. So think about what's gone on with data. Back in the 70s and 80s, there was the data explosion. People just started putting more and more information out there, but it still wasn't very accessible. And then in the 90s, they started developing a lot of tools to make that information more accessible. So for instance, if you even just think about the way things like a Google search has changed over time, you can find a lot more information than you could ever find before. But in the early days, you got back a lot of garbage, things that didn't make a lot of sense in it, and they weren't necessarily related to what you were searching for. But then in the 2000s and beginning at the beginning of this decade, the big data movement started, and the big data movement was all about realizing the fact that tons of information, if organized correctly, could actually be meaningful. And so that's what began to happen and is happening today. How do we take a lot of information, organize it in a way that it's meaningful? And then now the thing that's beginning to happen is that now you got all this data and you can sort of understand what that data means in current context. Can you now start to understand how that data may predict the future? And a lot of that is where the artificial intelligence game comes to play, is in what we call predictive analytics. So what about company trends? Sometimes this is a little controversial, this part, but I think most of you will agree that you see many of these trends. What I call the primary company trend is the lessening role of the corporation. And what I mean by that is that the corporation's role in my life as the only place where I can make a living and ply my trade is becoming less and less true. And it's happening really both because of the change in me as an employee and what I think about in terms of work, but it's also happening because the company is changing what they do. So there are three areas I want to focus on there. The first area is what I call just-in-time resources, which is really just a fancy way of saying contracting. More and more companies are having fewer full-time employees and instead bringing people in only when they need them, which makes you, which certainly gives you many more opportunities to work in the company, but also gives you less of a sense of the company being a place that you'll always work at. There are fewer safety nets in companies. They don't do as many retirement plans. They don't do as many long-term activities that help you ensure that you're going to stay there. And then finally, I think one of the biggest changes, whether you're, wherever your politics may be, most studies highlight the fact that one of the biggest reasons why people don't tend to be to change jobs or take risks with new jobs is because of the fear of losing health care or not having health care. And as we begin to make health care much more available outside of the company, you're going to see that the role of the company is going to be increasingly less important. It's kind of an oxymoron in a way there, but and then job trends. One of the important things about job trends is that I've always enjoyed, many of you have probably seen this quote before, but the quote is that the fastest growing job in the future doesn't even exist yet today. And I've always thought that to be fascinating because I saw this quote a few years back where it says, the skills required to do your job today will be obsolete in 3 years. And when you think about that, the whole concept that we've really based sourcing on in the first 30 decades that we did much in the way of sourcing was really based on understanding career path and whether that career path makes you absolutely right for the next job. But the reality today is that that career paths could be multidimensional, and your skills and backgrounds could involve multiple types of jobs and multiple diversions from what may have been the original career path. So, for instance, if you're looking for a marketing director today, the ideal candidate might not have been somebody who spent 20 years in marketing, but instead moved around and did multiple types of jobs, including potentially even forming their own company for a while. So now I'm going to shift to how these trends might affect today's organization. So some of the questions that we'll think about as we're going through this section is where will you find staff? Why will those staff choose to work for you? How diverse will they be? How will they invest in themselves over time and not just count on the company to invest in them? And how will they manage their career over time as opposed to how they may have done it in the past? So one radical prediction, though, before I jump into the details on that, I want to give you one radical prediction. So this prediction was done about 15 years ago. And the prediction basically goes like this. It says the corporation of the future will be made up of one employee, a dog. The employee is there to monitor the machines, and the dog is there to make sure that she or he doesn't touch anything. Again, that's a paraphrase of a prediction made by John Seely Brown, who at the time was the Chief Technology Officer for Xerox Corporation. And I think he made that prediction in the 1980s. Obviously, we're not quite to the point where there's only one employee and a dog running everything out there, but certainly there's been radical change in the way the workforce interacts with employment these days. Before we go on, I also want to offer another quick thinker toy. So what about this? What if you ran $1 billion corporation, but you only had 4 employees? What would that mean for resource discovery? And what would it mean for human resource management? I want you to think about that as we go along. And the other thing is I also want you to think about the fact that this isn't that absurd of a situation. And I'll use one really quick example. My son works in the film industry, and one of the classic things that happen in film these days, it used to be that a big production studio like Sony or one of the other major studios would essentially own everything and run it from A to Z. But what happens today is that essentially about 2 or 3% of the people that work on a film actually work for the major company, and everybody else is a consortium of people brought together just to get the job done. You also see that in healthcare these days, by the way. Oftentimes at a hospital, you actually have the core staff being regular employees, but the majority of the doctors, the nurses, and everyone else are only part-time employees. So this trend of people using people only when they need them is increasing, and our ability to actually figure out career paths, to find the right people, to plug them into the right job is an interesting challenge that we're all going to be facing. So now I'm going to move to how AI addresses these trends. So what are some of the key capabilities of AI as it relates to understanding resourcing and understanding trends? So I want to go through each of the 5 of these in a little bit of detail. First, the first one is that AI translates uncommon terms. So when people are talking about themselves in the social network or professional network world, they may not use the same term that we're all used to. They may not call themselves a programmer. They may call themselves a hacker. We need to understand that a hacker may mean that it's somebody with extraordinary programming skills and not somebody that's just trying to break into your computer. And more people talk about and use these new words to describe themselves, the more important it is to understand and translate those into common terms. The second thing is that AI can find hidden patterns. So if people have a certain kind of background before their last job, and in some cases that background suggests that they don't do very well at the job, in other cases it suggests they do quite well at the job, with large amounts of data you can begin to understand and see that pattern and understand what's happening in that area. By the way, another important part of pattern recognition is also your hiring pattern. So let's say, for instance, you hire client services people and you hire maybe 10 or 15 a year, or maybe 20 or 30 a year. Every time you say yes to one person and no to another, artificial intelligence-based solutions can start to understand the difference between when you said yes and when you said no. The other thing is that that AI did not rely on consistent descriptions. So in other words, if you're describing yourself as a marketing director in one situation, and another person's describing themselves as a chief idea officer or a chief public relations, that's probably a bad example, but a chief logo reputation builder or something like that. The AI capabilities can understand that even though that's an inconsistent description of the job, they can see the pattern and understand how it relates to the same kind of person. The other is that that AI can be used to create less obvious matches, and I'm going to show you an example of this in a couple of minutes. But what this really means is that a lot of times when we as sourcing professionals are looking for somebody, we don't recognize the fact that a person with a background of one kind of skills and experiences may be a perfect match for the job, but it's not obvious that they are because of some of the skills and backgrounds they have. So let me just use a quick example there. So for instance, if you, again, apologize for using marketing as an example a lot, but it's one we can all understand, I think. If you're looking for somebody who might be, say, an entry-level marketing communication specialist, you're going to look for people who have marketing in their background, probably got a degree in marketing, et cetera, but you may not look for somebody who has a degree in, say, journalism and has had some experience perhaps working in promoting or developing content in some fashion for maybe an online magazine or something of that sort. But the reality is they probably be an excellent entry-level communication specialist in a marketing environment. And then the last thing, which in some cases can be one of the more interesting areas, is that the use of artificial intelligence gets smarter. So in a lot of ways it works like a person does. If you spend a lot of time looking at a lot of different resumes, over time you begin to recognize that people with a certain background are more important to you than people without, or have a higher chance of success, et cetera, et cetera. So same thing happens in AI, that the more you use it, the more you spend time with tools built in AI, the more those tools start to tune themselves to the way in which you or your organization makes decisions. So how will AI enable both sourcing professionals and job seekers? What I'm going to do now is I'm going to give you some examples in this slide and the next slide of exactly how artificial intelligence can help you. So first of all, let's talk about sourcing professionals. I have 5 areas identified here. The first is with just simply efficiency. One of the things about using advanced search and match tools is that instead of you spending your time going through hundreds of resumes, you can actually use a machine to go through millions of them, and it can use algorithms developed either by you or by the company that helps you figure out who is the most likely candidate that you would like to look at. So it can make the process a lot more efficient because you can go through a lot more information in a shorter period of time. The second thing that AI can really do is it can help you find hard-to-find skills. And not only can it do this because it can find the exact skills, so in other words, it can help you find a purple squirrel, but what's more important than that is that it can also help you find the gray squirrel, the person who's pretty close to what you want, but maybe not exactly right. And so, for instance, one of our customers is in the aerospace world, and they build satellites for NASA. And they've got some skill sets that they're, as they claim, they say there's only about 35 people in the country that really have these skills, and they have 12 of them already. So you either get into a world of trying to steal away the other 13, or you start to understand the fact that there are people who are very close to the skills that you need, and with a little background, a little support, you can get them in a hurry. You can get them to where they need to be in a hurry. The other thing is, as you know, most recruiters end up finding fertile grounds where they find their best people. So if you're looking for a great salesman, you may always look to people who've worked at places like maybe ADP or IBM if you're into software services kinds of sales, or you may look to to Coca-Cola or some other company if you're looking for consumer kinds of goods, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that that these new tools can do is they can they can discover new fertile fields that you've never thought about searching in before. A fourth area, it has to do with skill matching. And so this is a little bit about what I talked about before, which is that even though a person's job title may not be exactly what you're looking for, you can understand how skills relate to the job in a much more comprehensive fashion than you can do when you're just doing a manual review of a resume. And the last area, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more later also, is referrals. And the reason why I bring up referrals is because every single employee has an increasing number of contacts that they've made in social and professional networks. And that opens up an opportunity for you to tap into that network, or for the employees themselves to tap into that network in a way that's never happened before. Now, on the job seeker side, I'm going to talk about 3 items really quickly. The first item I want to talk about is what I call skill matching. So if you think about the mirror image of what a sourcing professional is doing, think about what a job seeker is doing. So here's a quick example for you. If I'm an unemployed person and I'm looking for a new job, one of the things that you can do using some of these tools is you can basically load all your skills into a tool like ours, and then that will spit out different kinds of jobs that you actually could qualify for. So in other words, rather than just saying, look, I used to be a welder, and I'm not sure what the skills of welding actually allow me to do, since there's not a lot of welding going on in my community anymore, how can I figure out how my skills may match to other jobs? This also helps people in career change, by the way. In the example that I just used, one of the things that probably all of you are aware about is the fact that because of the changing nature of our economy, a lot of people are ending up either being displaced, or they're interested in changing their career, and they want to know what career opportunities are in front of them. And by understanding how their skills match to various jobs, they can look at places that they could begin to qualify for. And then the last part of that is what I call skill direction. And what I'm talking about there is the fact that if you had always wanted to be a veterinary technician, as an example, and let's say you got an undergraduate degree in biology and you spent the last bunch of your years working in a lab someplace, but you really wanted to get into working as a vet tech, you could actually use AI type searching and matching to say, okay, I already have a certain set of skills. What skills am I missing, and how do I get those skills in order to qualify for a job I would really like to do? So those are some examples of ways in which artificial intelligence-based tools can help both the sourcing professional and the job seeker. Another thinker toy. One of the things that I think is fascinating is that this is a study that was done, I think, about 5 or 6 years ago. But one of the things that I run into a lot is, especially when people hear that we're working a lot with public profile information, is to what extent can you actually trust that data? And I found this to be fascinating when I found this study about 5 or 6 years ago from Cornell's Social Media Lab. And as you can read, it basically says resumes posted on the popular professional network site LinkedIn contain fewer lies about work experience than traditional paper copies of resumes. And if you think about it, here's the reason why. And it's interesting because the study goes on to talk about this, but then there's been other studies since then that have also evaluated this. And the reason why is because there's 2 dynamics that go on in a person's mind when they think about posting their current job or their accomplishments online. One of the things they think about, and it turns out to be true, is that when they put that information out there, if they're lying, they're oftentimes found out, because that information is so public. If I said I went to Harvard University and I graduated in 1978, when in reality I was nowhere near Harvard in 1978, someone's going to figure that out and call me out. The second thing is that most people, when they develop a resume, have the mindset that I'm going to hand it to one person. They might hand it around to 4 more potential people who will interview me, but probably nobody in that group of 5 will ever have any background that would be able to confirm whether or not my resume was accurate. So it's really not as strange as you think when you evaluate the fact that social media data can be oftentimes much more accurate. So Roscoe, the recruiter here, is now going to talk to you a little bit about how you'll be using AI in the near future. First of all, I want to talk about 4 ways in which artificial intelligence could be, or maybe already is in use in human resources today. If you look along the right-hand side and a little bit around along the bottom, that's really around the sourcing world, matching employees to skills, job fitness, employee referral programs, talent discovery, and the middle one really being skill verification. Those are all areas around sourcing in general. But I'll come back to those in a minute, but I want to talk about just briefly some of the other areas that exist out there. So for instance, one of the things that's happening these days is in the policy tracking area, if you have a policy, let's say, that says your employees can't talk about sales or marketing or product things that are going on in the company because you don't want other people to know about it. So let's say, for instance, you've got a salesman that pops a tweet out there that says, "Hey, we had a great meeting today with IBM. I think we're going to be able to take that account away from their current vendor, and we're really excited." And if you have a policy that says you're not supposed to do that, then you can actually use these advanced AI techniques to actually monitor and identify whether or not somebody is talking about things they shouldn't be talking about. And you don't have to use it as a hammer. You can use it as a training tool. In our particular company, we really feel like we need to be good citizens of the public universe and not be people trying, like NSA, trying to find out secrets or whatever the case may be. And so you can use something like that to help employees understand that, wait a minute, this is the right use of social media and this is the wrong use of it. Same thing with employee engagement. We had one company early on when we were developing our tool that asked us if we could potentially track every time they rolled out, say, a major new policy, if they were going to reorganize the company, or they were bringing in a new healthcare provider, or they were starting a new product initiative or something of that sort. Could you actually track the kind of chatter that happens from your employees? Are they excited about it? Are they not excited about it? And then what does that mean for your company, and whether or not you're engaging people or describing your experiences the way you mean to? And then, as I said, I want to talk a little bit about resourcing and how resourcing plays into this. So I'm going to jump to some new slides. This next set of slides, I'm actually going to use an example. And the example I'm going to use is the process that we went through to develop the tool that we use. I'm only using it as just an example, but I want to show you sort of how artificial intelligence has been, how we applied it to help with resource discovery. There are several other companies that are starting to do this these days, and most of them are following a somewhat similar kind of pattern. So I think this will give you a good example of exactly what I mean. So to start with, I want to focus on the point that when you think about the pool of people that you really have access to, and how many people out there could really do the job that you're looking for, that pool is relatively small compared to how many people could really do the job. And I think this is just some interesting data. So this slide is essentially showing you that there's 156 million people working in the United States today. Canada adds another several million as well. And that 74% of the people say that they're willing to leave their current job. This is a study that was done about a year ago. 74% of people say they're willing to leave their current job for the right kind of opportunity. But the reality is you'll find very few of them. And so if you actually now start to have tools that say, wait a minute, the entire workforce is possibly my recruiting canvas. How do I find the right needle in a haystack of 156 million people. So we saw that as one of the problems, or one of the key items that we wanted to solve. And so then we began starting to think about how do we narrow that problem down a little bit. And the thing that we decided to focus on was the fact that, that the network of people that your employees are connected to is gigantic. And so while focusing on 156 million people is not impossible, making the problem a little more manageable, we decided to focus on the concept of employee referrals. And this is the kind of data that was compelling to us. So it says here, and this, by the way, was about a year, almost 2 years ago, I guess, when we started doing this. And I think the data could be even stronger now. It says 77% of the U.S. population uses the Internet on a monthly basis, and 62% of Internet users have a Facebook or LinkedIn account. So you're talking about the majority of people out there are connected. And again, I actually think this data is higher now. And based on a recent study, the average social media user has about 200 connections. I have about 700. I'm not average, obviously. Some people only have 100 or so. But what we found in the work that we've done is that 200 is probably very accurate. We're finding that that's a very common thing. And so if you put those two things together, if you have 1,000 employees, that's going to translate to a network of 95,480 people that you could be reaching if you had real access to those people. And by the way, the reason why this isn't 1,000 times 200 is because some people don't have connections and because some connections overlap. But again, that's a huge amount of people, close to 100,000 people that you could potentially consider as your recruiting pool, but the reality is you'll get very few of them ever referred to you. So how do we go about beginning to understand the data out there and creating a manageable process for using that data? What we did was, the first process we took, or the first step we took was, we looked at over 40 million profiles. And what we mean by profiles is it's the various ways in which people leave a digital footprint that's relevant to the work experience. So that means you could simply describe your job or put a job title out there. It could mean that you actually talk about where you're working, what you're doing, and the skill sets you have. It could be any combination of those things. So we poured over 40 million profiles. We had a grant from the National Science Foundation, spent over a year working on this, looking at over 40 million profiles to identify the fact that those profiles really didn't represent 40 million distinct kinds of people. They really boiled down to about 9,000 catalog skills, key things that people do. So for instance, I'll use the example of if you described yourself as a customer executive, that overlaps with a client service representative at a certain level. And so we're able to boil that down. You'll see a lot of that kind of thing in ONET, if for any of you who have worked on that. Again, that's called ONET. Then what we did once we kind of boiled those profiles down to skills, to overlapping skills, is then we looked at job descriptions. So we pulled about 200,000 job descriptions from multiple sources, in some cases from published job descriptions that you'd find on like company websites. In other cases, it would be at places like Indeed or Career Builder or Hot Jobs, etc. And we pulled those 200,000 job descriptions together, and we boiled it down to 14,000 obvious jobs. Again, something you can see in ONET also, and then created 2,000 clusters. And what that means again is that you cluster jobs around common skill sets. And then once we did that, remember the example that I showed you earlier, is we started clustering that information so that you'd know that somebody who talked about being in QA or software testing or quality engineer would tend to have, at a high level of reliability, things like test automation, quality assurance, agile methodologies, regression testing in their backgrounds. And the same thing over on the geophysicist side. And then here's a little bit of how this works. So if you look at this slide, what I'm essentially showing you here is, this is a job description, and the job description is for a software quality engineer. And then within that job description, it talks about things like performing in-depth exploratory testing and using user stories and et cetera, to be able to test, et cetera. And it talks about tools like Cucumber and Waiter, WebDriver, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is the classic kind of job description that you might have. But then we take this job description, and using advanced searching tools and AI techniques, we're able then to map that job description to multiple other kinds of descriptions that exist within the same cluster. And so some of these are very obvious. It would be very easy for you to think about someone like a QA lead or a QA engineer or a compliance engineer as potentially being the kind of person you're looking for. But some of them are less obvious, like a metrology technician. That's actually somebody who's got a background in measurements and understands how to measure and test in a highly measure-oriented kind of world, like measuring metal resistance and things of that sort. So essentially, you pull all these together and you say, okay, if you listed your job as senior test engineer, which exists right there in the middle of the screen, senior test engineer, you also might not realize that you should look for these other areas. But even if you did look for these other areas, you need to understand the extent to which they overlap. So we essentially create a skill cloud. And what the skill cloud shows you is that the items in red show you the things that you as a recruiter or a hiring manager, those are the things that you put in your requirements. The things in gray are the things that our analysis told us are also important, but you didn't put in there. And so we're smart enough to make up for the fact that you didn't put in all the critical skills that you should have. And then essentially based on mapping to both job titles and skills, you can then create a scoring that tells you, even though somebody's job title may be metrology technician, the fact that they overlap with multiple critical skill areas could give them a very high relationship to success in the job you posted. So that's essentially a way in which artificial intelligence can be used in the sourcing world. So now let me show you some samples of the uses of AI that give you some examples. So first of all, let's talk about talent clustering. And the reason you might talk about talent pools instead of clusters, but we think in the AI world sort of about clusters. So let me tell you a couple of cluster ideas that are powerful. So one cluster idea is simply geography. So think about this. Let's say, for instance, that you work for a company that only has 10 employees, but you work in, let's say, the northern area of Chicago. You can actually create a cluster that, in this particular case, let's say for employee referrals, but it doesn't have to be employee referrals. It can just simply mean that you create a cluster that identifies the fact that people within a 50-mile radius of your company are essentially the fertile ground that you want to recruit in, and then you create a very specific talent pool based on geography. But you can also do that based on skills. So let's say you don't so much care about geography, or maybe you do, but geography is not the only thing, especially with hard-to-find skills. So you can create special clusters simply around skill categories. Where we find this in use a whole lot is in technology. So people will create clusters that cross over geography and jobs and companies to be able to target multiple kinds of talent who have a specific skill set, like, for instance, Ruby on Rails programming or web development or any other particular kind of skill that you're looking for. And then what about a custom job? So if you're sitting there thinking to yourself that one of the things that makes us different than everybody else is that we hire customer service people who are not like other customer service people. Well, you can also customize what you're looking for. So not only do you take advantage of the fact that you've got all this science that predicts goodness of fit, but you can also then tune that science to say, but for us, it's a slightly different person. I keep hitting the up rather than the down arrow. So I want to use a specific example. We were working with a national real estate company where in their recruiting, they basically said they never look for a real estate agent as a job title when they're hiring. Instead, they look for people who have a background that they think means that the best next job for them would be real estate, as opposed to having been one somewhere else. In other words, they don't want to spend all their time trying to steal agents away from other people. They want to train them in-house and make them their kind of agent. So what we were able to do with them is that we did extensive research of the kind of people they hired before that were really successful, and we tuned that agent to identify the fact that in this particular case, people who had ever had a position of high independence, so they ran their own company, they worked as a independent consultant or something like that, tended to have a high success rate in being a real estate agent in their company. I'm going to learn how to hit that down arrow. The other is bank teller. I'm not going to go into that one a whole lot, but I threw that out there because it's a very simplistic kind of thing. Most people who look for bank tellers, what are you looking for? Somebody who's comfortable handling money, somebody who is comfortable working with the public, and so maybe you'll find out that a cashier at Burger King would be an excellent bank teller, but you never would have thought about looking in that kind of a job cluster before. And the last area I want to talk to you about is job mapping as a sample use. This one is pretty exciting and getting a lot of play these days. And I'm going to give you two examples that are very relevant. One of them is military vets. So one of the biggest problems that military vets have is let's say you just spent the last 5 years of your life being a tank commander. Well, how in the world does that relate to a civilian job? And one of the opportunities that you have with advanced AI techniques and searching and matching tools is that you can actually step back and you can dissect that skill set, and you can say, look, being a tank commander, what are the core competencies they have? They have leadership. They have probably some technical skills, especially with instrumentation. They probably have good communication skills. And it may turn out that a tank commander would make an excellent GUI designer, or maybe a terrific business analyst, etc. And so you can really leverage that these tools to help you figure that out. And another area that we're getting a whole lot of play in these days is people who are displaced workers. People who, for one reason or another, the economy has put them in a position where for the last 20 years they've been in manufacturing. They want to work for at least another 20 years, and they don't know where to go. And oftentimes these techniques can help you, again, understand core competencies and how they relate to careers you never would have thought about. So real quickly, I'm just going to go over those last two one more time. So what if every veteran knew exactly how their skills fit into the private job market? So every single veteran, no matter what their background was, could be shown how their skills and experience directly translate to a public sector job title. And then what if every manufacturing employee laid off after 20 years knew just what type of job he or she could do next? And again, that's the kind of skill set, that's the kind of power that that is kind of exciting about some of these new tools in resource discovery using advanced technologies and techniques. And so, in conclusion, what I want to show you real briefly is four key things that I think we talked about in terms of sort of refining the perfect fit. The first item is that artificial intelligence is a growing force, and it's being used by LinkedIn, Indeed, CareerBuilder, and others to improve resource discovery. So if you're a recruiter in a small company, or even a recruiter in a large company, and you think artificial intelligence is way too out there for you, or something that's just not proven enough or not used well enough, the reality is it's being used quite a bit these days, and there's quite a pattern of use that you can really count on. So you're no longer being asked to be at the bleeding edge. You're just being part of the leading edge. The next area is that artificial intelligence can find the gray squirrel, and the gray squirrel is the one that's that improbably perfect fit. So in other words, there's been a lot of talk about the purple squirrel, which is I need to find the exact person, somebody who is a perfect fit for my job. They've done all the things that I need them to do, and they've done it before. And while I would never argue with you that the purple squirrel is a great hire, What I would argue with you is the fact that maybe not now, maybe not even next year, but I think all of you would agree that resource constraints, or not being able to find the right people to fill the jobs to support the growth of your company, is going to be an increasing problem. And so we're going to have to be better at finding the gray squirrel, finding that person who's maybe done 75 to 80% of the things that you need, but they've done the right 75 to 80% that suggests they can be very successful in a short period of time. Also, AI gets smarter. So the tools that are out there today are pretty darn good, but every time it's being used, it's getting better and better. So what you're going to find over the course of the next decade is that tools that were very good at resource discovery are going to be extraordinarily good at it. But not only are they going to be extraordinarily good at it, you're going to be able to tune them so they're good at it for you. So not only is it going to get better at finding salespeople, but it's going to get better at finding your salespeople, and that's an extremely powerful algorithm. And then the other thing is that the advantage of artificial intelligence or other advanced search and matching kinds of techniques is that they're very good at dealing with unstructured, out-of-context data. And let me explain one more thing really quickly about this. If you think about public profiles, so a lot of people will tell you that the resume is dead. Whether you believe that or not, the truth is the resume is not the only relevant piece of information anymore about who you are and what you do. But if you think about public profiles, the way in which you describe yourself in the professional and social world, you don't necessarily follow this perfect structure of previous employment, skills, job interests, et cetera, that a classic resume does. So it's not that big of a deal, and it's been happening for at least 2 decades, that people have stripped resumes and then categorized the data so that you could search on that information. It becomes a lot harder problem to do that with public profiles, because if you think about the way a public profile looks in Google or Facebook or LinkedIn or GitHub or any number of any social or professional networks, people can put in information in any way they want to, and the tools involved in advanced searching these days are very good at taking that information, that unstructured, out-of-context data, and turning it into something that you can use. So now I want to open it up for questions. Let me pop in here and see if people have asked any questions yet. All right, I've got one question that I've got is about privacy. So the question of privacy, this is an excellent question, because one of the things that's happening these days is that people are worried about the fact that you know, it comes to that earlier slide that I showed that everything you do these days, literally everything you do, is captured in one way or another. So if you're written about in the local newspaper that you just did something or accomplished something or got a job, a new job or a promotion or whatever, that information is now is part of the public footprint, the digital footprint that you're leaving behind. And if you start out as a 10-year-old, by the time you're 50, especially today in today's world, by the time you're 50, the extent of information out there about you is gigantic. And so you really have 2 choices in life. One choice you have is to be incredibly fearful of that and try not to have very much public information out there about you at all. Another sub-choice of that is that you can worry about, and or people can deploy that information in a way that violates your privacy and the public information that's out there. Or you can flip that whole equation around and say we need to be part of a world where we respect privacy. We understand the fact that somebody went out and had a drink last night has absolutely nothing to do with the fact that they could be great at my job. But the fact that they went to a seminar last night and learned a foreign language and we're trying to expand our business into Europe and we're looking for people who could speak French, might be very relevant to the job. So what I see happening is I see the social science and the professional science catching up to the technical science over the course of the next decade. And so while privacy is a little bit scary today, I see a lot of people working on the tools that will make it less and less so. And one of the things that we do in our own environment, for instance, is what we've built is we built a tool that allows the employee to manage their own data, and then they choose to share or not share the information. And that's a way in which we've been able to control that. Let me see if I can find other questions. All right. That's all I see for questions right now. Kathy, I'll pass it back to you.
Well, thank you so much, Jerry, for presenting this very informative webinar today. And just a reminder to the attendees who are attending live, you will receive an email from hr.com with the certification credit information within about 1 to 2 business days. If you are watching this in archive format, your credit information will be placed in your account upon clicking the small box called Redeem Your Credit. We definitely value your feedback, and I'm sure Jerry does too, so please take a moment to fill out the exit survey that will appear on your screen once I have closed down the webinar room. This concludes our webcast for today, and thank you again for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day.